In San Francisco, the transit map looks clean only when it is printed. In reality, it is layered over cold water, fill dirt, landfill, fractured hills, and a downtown built on what used to be tide. BART was designed to move through that geography as if it were simple: a set of stations, a set of tunnels, a single line of motion that could be trusted. It promised a kind of modern silence, an engineered calm by carrying thousands of people beneath streets that were already crowded and beneath a bay that had always been a boundary. The infrastructure that made that promise possible still exists, largely unchanged in its basic shape. It also contains the conditions for a specific kind of horror, the kind produced when a system is too essential to stop and too complex to fully understand while it is moving. The Transbay crossing is where that contradiction becomes physical. The tube does not feel like a bridge, even though it serves the same purpose. It is a sealed passage under the bay, a long and continuous confinement that turns the idea of commute into something closer to containment. The historic photographs taken toward the tube capture it as a neat opening in the distance, a precise mouth cut into the shoreline, surrounded by industrial flatness that offers no shelter and no drama. That is the point. It looks like ordinary civil engineering. It is ordinary until something goes wrong and there is nowhere to go. BART's planners embraced automation early and with unusual confidence. The trains were designed to be operated under computer control, with humans supervising a system that, in theory, could supervise itself. That decision was not a minor detail. It shaped everything. Automated control demands consistent track geometry, predictable braking performance, reliable wayside equipment, and a communications architecture that can sustain operations through tunnels, curves, stations, crossovers, and interlockings. It also demands a culture that can acknowledge small abnormalities as meaningful, because automation does not forgive ambiguity. When a machine is the primary actor, the consequences of misinterpretation are delayed until the moment they become irreversible. This is why the earliest descriptions of BART's safety concerns often read like arguments about tone rather than about damage. In the early years, the fears were not always about catastrophe. They were about the system's temperament. People described the way the train would accelerate into darkness with a confidence that felt impersonal. They described the sound in underground stations, fans, traction motors, the high electrical edge of the third rail, as if it were a constant reminder that the system was alive even when it was not visible. These are not irrational impressions. They are accurate sensory reports from a built environment where movement is delegated, where the passenger is reduced to a load, and where the true state of the system is hidden behind walls. The third rail is part of what makes that hidden state disturbing. It is not simply a power source. It is a long, continuous hazard that runs beside the track, close enough to touch, concealed by a coverboard that appears, to the untrained eye, like a simple piece of protective carpentry. BART's third rail has a history that is openly discussed in its own engineering communications: different manufacturing eras, different conductivity profiles, and a life cycle that depends on wear, corrosion, and the realities of maintenance labor. BART has described how earlier third rail segments, supplied in the system's early decades, could be flipped after wear, and how later replacements were heavier, less conductive, and spread across the system as extensions were built. The details are technical, but the implication is not. The rail's useful life is finite, and the system outlives the parts that keep it running. In the East Bay, near Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill, the tracks run through stretches that look open and safe from a distance: daylight, median space, concrete, and a view of surrounding roads. It is the kind of place where the public assumes nothing truly hidden can happen. The photographs of BART trains in Contra Costa County show bright cars crossing ordinary structures, a calm image of transit as routine. But the routine depends on vigilance at a granular level. Fasteners, geometry, switch points, wheel profiles, maintenance windows, radio discipline, and the relentless fact that a train's path is fixed. BART's institutional language, operations rules, safety programs, manuals, has always tried to contain the system in words. The words imply control. They imply that risk can be bounded. What emerges when you read the reports generated after incidents is that BART's most severe failures are not exotic. They are failures of small objects and small decisions. A worn switch point, a wheel flange within tolerance but near its limit, a cover that should have stayed in place, a work practice that assumes the worker will always see the train in time. The system's danger is not that it is unpredictable. The danger is that it is predictable in the way pressure vessels are predictable. If you run them long enough, the weak points eventually find their moment. The story that follows is usually told as a sequence of separate events: a derailment here, a fire there, an accident involving workers years later. BART itself has tried to keep those stories separate because each event has its own cause code, its own corrective actions, its own jurisdictional language. But the system does not experience its history as separate. It experiences history as where. The tunnels and the tube and the track structure do not reset between decades. They accumulate adjustments. They carry forward institutional habits. They become a single archive made of metal. When BART shuts down, even partially, the Bay Area reacts as if the ground has shifted. The reaction is not only logistical, it is psychological. People do not simply lose a commute, they lose an assumption of continuity. The first time that assumption truly broke at the region's core was not during a strike or a protest or a storm. It was in the tube, under the bay, when a failure along the track environment produced smoke that could not be reasoned with, and when the system's designed calm became an evacuation corridor defined by visibility, breath, and the sound of radios that did not coordinate quickly enough. What makes the tube incident linger is not only the death and injuries that followed, though those are documented. It is the way it reveals the hidden dimension of the system, the distance between how BART is meant to operate and how it behaves under stress. BART was designed to make movement feel normal. In the tube, normality depends on ventilation, lighting, communication, and the assumption that the train is safe to remain until it is not. If that assumption fails, the passenger becomes a person on foot in an environment designed for vehicles. The tube is long enough that the idea of walking out feels abstract until it becomes mandatory. The lights recede, the walls repeat, the noise changes when the train is no longer moving. The air becomes something you notice, and in the background, always present even when you do not look directly at it, is the power rail, the equipment housings, the covers, the small metal parts that exist to keep electricity and motion separated from human skin. When investigators formally described what happened in the tube, the event had already passed into a different category in the public mind. For many writers, it became a story about fear and smoke and darkness. For engineers, it became a story about a specific electrical short circuit triggered by a specific piece of metal that should not have moved. For firefighters, it became a story about the limits of rescue in a sealed underwater tunnel. The official record would later reduce it to a probable cause, a fatality count, and a closure date. The system would reopen, the trains would run again, and the tube would return to being a blank segment on a map, hiding the fact that for a period of time, BART's core artery was unusable because the track environment itself had turned against the people inside it. Behavior at the exact moment the train needed to slow down. The published recollections emphasize the speed and the helplessness of the attendant attempting to stop a train that had been instructed by a defect in its own logic to do the opposite. The frightening aspect is not that the system lacked brakes, it is that the system had brakes and did not apply them correctly because a small signal was wrong. That early crash did not kill anyone, but it framed a question BART would face repeatedly. When control is distributed among automated equipment, wayside systems, and human supervision, where does responsibility actually live? In a tunnel or a tube, the question becomes more than philosophical. It becomes a timeline measured in seconds. 2 decades later, on the night of December 17, 1992, a southbound 6-car BART train derailed in a downtown Oakland tunnel near 12th Street Station, moving through A05 interlocking. The time, approximately 11:21 p.m., is repeated in the reports with the precision of a clock that cannot be argued with. The American Public Transit Association's panel of inquiry described the derailment as the result of worn wheel and rail interaction at a facing switch point. The phrasing is technical, and it is meant to be calming. The equipment functioned as designed. The automatic operations equipment was not a contributing factor. The fasteners and ties were not to blame. And then the report's narrative shows how close the system can come to catastrophe, even when each individual element was within established standards. Worn conditions, each permitted in isolation, aligned into a geometry that allowed a wheel to climb over a switch rail. In that Oakland derailment, the details are unsettling precisely because they read like an anatomy lesson. The train was running in automatic mode, supervised by the Operations Control Center. The right-hand switch points and stock rail were severely worn. A wheel, also severely worn, climbed the closed switch point 18 to 24 inches south of the point of switch. The train continued moving as the angle between cars increased until cars struck a concrete curtain wall. 14 passengers suffered minor injuries. There were no fatalities, but the report notes the destruction of third rail and coverboard, 10 feet of third rail, and about 100 feet of coverboard. In a tunnel, losing coverboard is not cosmetic, it is exposure. It is the difference between a controlled hazard and a bare one. The investigative conclusion, worn wheel and worn rail interaction, also reveals something else. It reveals that BART's safety margins were, in part, administrative. They existed in written standards, in tolerances that defined what wear was acceptable, and when the system operated near those limits, the limits themselves became a kind of risk. The panel recommended re-evaluating track wear standards and wheel wear standards, changing inspection practices, and restricting certain reverse movements. These are sane recommendations. They are also a reminder that for a period of time, the system had been operating in a state where a different combination of wear could have produced deaths. BART's own communications about the third rail, published years later during replacement projects, read like a parallel history of deferred consequences. The agency described its earlier third rail as a product of the 1960s and 1970s, supplied by Kaiser Aluminum, and noted that the original design could be flipped after about 20 years of wear. The useful life, BART said, is about 20 years, and as rail ages, efficiency and performance will be impacted. The language is polite. What it implies is continuous degradation in a system that the public experiences as binary. Either the train runs or it does not. Riders do not feel a micro-ohm per foot. They feel a delay, a shutdown, a strange stop in a tunnel. BART also described different conductivity styles, including a more conductive version used where there were longer distances between traction power substations, nicknamed in internal folklore with a casual term that does not fit the seriousness of what it powered. That naming habit is itself revealing. It shows how the deadly parts of the system become familiar, how they are domesticated in the language of the people who work around them. Familiarity is necessary for labor. It is also dangerous because it can dull the imagination at exactly the time imagination is needed, when asking what happens if a cover comes loose, or if smoke enters a car, or if a radio call is misunderstood in a confined space. By 1979, those what-if questions would become an event, and the event's initiating failure would not be a dramatic collision or a terrorist attack or an earthquake. It would be a loose piece of aluminum, a line cover associated with the collector shoe assembly that fell in the wrong place and bridged a gap that should not have been bridgeable. The system's power, which normally remains obediently contained, would find that path instantly. It would create an electrical short circuit and ignite materials that were not prepared to resist flame and toxic smoke. The BART system's most important underwater corridor would become unusable, not because the tube cracked or flooded, but because the environment inside it could no longer be safely occupied. And if that sounds like a narrow, freak occurrence, the later decades would provide a different kind of corroboration, a reminder that on rail systems, the boundary between routine and fatality is as thin as procedure. In 2013, near Walnut Creek, 2 workers would be killed on BART's main tracks during what began as a routine response to a reported dip in the track. The detail matters. Even when the failure is not yet catastrophic, the system attracts people to the track environment to measure it, to confirm it, to decide whether it is within tolerance. That is where danger concentrates, at the exact location where a defect is being examined, while trains continue to run because the system is designed to keep running. The pattern is not mystical, it is mechanical, it is institutional. It is the consequence of building a system that cannot easily stop and then asking human beings to occupy its right-of-way under rules that presume perfect attention, perfect communication, and perfect luck. The tube fire would force a shutdown that lasted months. Later incidents would force rule changes that arrived only after bodies unbalanced. The system would adapt, in the way complex systems always adapt, after the fact, with paperwork and replacement programs and revised manuals. But the darkness under the bay would remain the same darkness, and the idea of walking out of a stopped train in a sealed tube would remain, for those who knew the history, as a realistic possibility rather than an abstract fear. On January 17, 1979, BART train number 117 caught fire in the Transbay Tube. The date has remained fixed in the official record because it was the day the system's most central passage stopped being a passage and became a scene. The National Transportation Safety Board would later determine that the probable cause was an electrical short circuit initiated when a loose aluminum line cover fell and bridged the gap between the third rail and part of the train's truck assembly. That is the kind of sentence that can be read quickly, as if it were merely a technical explanation. It is not. It is a description of a system designed to keep 1,000 volts contained, defeated by a small piece of metal in the wrong orientation. When the short occurred, it ignited materials that were not adequately fire-resistant. The NTSB's findings point to the significance of smoke and toxic byproducts and to the way interior components, seat cushions, and other materials contributed to conditions that were difficult to survive in a confined environment. This is not an abstract lesson about flammability. In a tunnel, smoke is not a secondary effect. Smoke is the event. Smoke removes sight, then direction, then breath. Under the bay, it also removes the comforting thought that there is open air nearby. The tube's environment shaped every decision that followed. The evacuation, the rescue, the communications, all of it occurred in a space designed for trains, not for crowds on foot. The NTSB found that emergency evacuation was delayed and disorganized, that communication systems failed to coordinate quickly and properly, and that training for emergency procedures in a subaqueous environment was inadequate. The ventilation system, in this context, is not just an engineering feature. It becomes the difference between a survivable corridor and a lethal one. And the report notes that ventilation was ineffective in clearing smoke from the evacuation path. 1 firefighter died. 40 people were injured. Those numbers can be spoken plainly, and they often are, because a documentary record demands plainness. But the numbers do not convey what it means for a firefighter to die inside an underwater tube, in smoke, during the effort to remove passengers who did not choose to enter a disaster zone. In many transit fires, the image the public carries is flame. In the tube, the defining condition was the atmosphere, smoke, heat, and the pressure of time as visibility and air quality collapsed. The consequences were immediate and regional. Passenger service through the tube was suspended until April 5, 1979. The shutdown lasted long enough to rewire public intuition about what BART was. It was not simply delayed, it was interrupted at its core artery, the link that made the system more than a set of local lines. If a bridge closes, people see the bridge. If the tube closes, the closure is invisible, and the reason for it is difficult to visualize without understanding the structure's isolation. A month is a long time to live with a disruption. 2.5 months is long enough for a shutdown to become part of the system's identity. In the years after the tube fire, BART and other agencies made changes that were framed as corrections: materials, procedures, coordination, and emergency planning. The system continued to run. Riders continued to enter the tube without thinking about line covers or collector shoes. This is how infrastructure persists. It relies on the public's ability to forget details. It relies on the fact that most trips end normally, and that normality is persuasive. But the tube fire also revealed a deeper truth. In BART, danger does not require speed. It does not require collision. It requires only the failure of separation. Separation between electricity and metal, between smoke and lungs, between the track environment and the human body. Once separation fails, the system's scale turns against the person. A single train car becomes a sealed compartment. A tunnel becomes a corridor without exits. A communications problem becomes a delay in direction that people cannot improvise safely. That same logic reappeared decades later in an accident of a different type, under different weather, in daylight. On October 19, 2013, BART train 963 struck and killed 2 roadway workers near Walnut Creek, California, on the Pittsburgh-Bay Point line between Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill. The accident did not occur in the tube. It occurred in open air at approximately 1:44 p.m. after workers entered the roadway under a practice known as simple approval. Under that process, control center authorization allowed employees to enter the roadway with no additional protective measures beyond their own vigilance and a watchman or lookout. The workers were there because of a reported dip in the track. They were inspecting a defect, exactly as a functioning maintenance culture would demand. The NTSB's accident brief describes the train as being operated in automatic mode under computer control. It states that the control and supervisory systems were functioning properly. In other words, the system did what it was designed to do. It moved a train along a main track at speed. The failure was procedural. The workers were required to provide their own protection, and the authorization they received depended solely on the roadway worker to provide protection from trains and moving equipment. That dependency was later named as probable cause. The onboard recorder captured a moment that has become a kind of condensed truth about track work, the instant when a human recognizes too late that the machine will not deviate. At 1:44:23 p.m., the operator trainee repeatedly pushed the emergency stop button and shouted, "Look out!" and "No, no, no." The train struck the 2 workers 4.7 seconds later. It is difficult to speak about those seconds without becoming theatrical, and it is not necessary. The seconds speak for themselves. They define how little time exists between awareness and impact at mainline speed. BART's own public statement after the Walnut Creek deaths describes the scene as a fatal accident involving 2 workers struck by an out-of-service train during a routine maintenance run, and notes that the workers were inspecting in response to a report of a dip in the track. The language is careful, partly because investigations were underway and the NTSB had assumed control of public statements. The carefulness is understandable. It is also part of the system's pattern, the slow conversion of a lethal event into a controlled narrative. Between the tube fire and the Walnut Creek deaths lies a continuity that is more unsettling than any single incident. Both events involve people placed in proximity to the track environment without adequate redundant protection. In 1979, passengers became pedestrians in smoke because containment failed. In 2013, workers became vulnerable because procedure assumed that looking up would be enough. In both cases, the system's normal operation, movement, power, schedule, was not designed to pause for human fragility unless that fragility was first translated into a formal block, a clearance, a protected work zone. The tube fire shut down the core Transbay service until April 5, 1979. The Walnut Creek accident triggered an immediate prohibition on simple approvals and led to broader roadway worker protection reforms. These changes are recorded as improvements, and they were, but they also demonstrate how long a dangerous practice can persist in an essential system, and how the system often requires a death to force a change that safety engineers had already described in different words. The darkest period in a transit system is not necessarily when it is physically damaged. It is when the system is functioning as intended, while humans are forced to negotiate its hazards using attention alone. It is a form of exposure that feels normal until it becomes fatal. And it is precisely that normality, the calm, routine movement of trains under computer control, that makes the record of these incidents feel cold when read years later. The machines did not panic. The machines did not hesitate. The machines continued, and the people in their path had seconds. After a system survives a deadly failure, it rarely becomes quieter. It becomes more administrative. The public sees new rules as reassurance. The workforce sees them as boundaries drawn in ink where previously the boundary was luck. The system itself remains what it always was: steel guided by geometry, electricity guided by insulation, and human bodies that do not belong on the right-of-way except when work demands it. In California, the Walnut Creek deaths accelerated a formal response. The NTSB accident brief notes that, as a result of the accident, the California Public Utilities Commission issued General Order 175 governing roadway worker protection for rail transit workers in the state, and that the order prohibited the type of access that had been allowed under BART's simple approval process. BART's Assistant Chief Transportation Officer issued a memo immediately prohibiting simple approvals, and BART's management later announced the prohibition as permanent. New requirements were instituted: reduced train speeds in work areas, dedicated watchmen, and an employee in charge to manage train traffic and communicate with approaching trains and the control center. The details are procedural, but they represent a fundamental admission. The track environment cannot be made safe by asking individuals to be perfect. It must be made safe by reducing the system's freedom of movement around them. This is what afterward looks like in a rail system. It is paperwork and training and committees, created in response to a moment that cannot be reversed. The reports describe peer reviews and compliance determinations, and they describe a roadway worker protection technology committee tasked with researching warning technologies. These are rational steps. They are also late. The record is explicit that the probable cause was BART's use of a process that required workers to provide their own protection. Once written, that sentence becomes a kind of permanent stain. It does not fade because it explains too much. In the system's physical infrastructure, the afterword looks like replacement. BART's description of third rail renewal under Measure RR is, on its surface, an ordinary story about reliability. Lighter stainless steel capped aluminum segments, improved conductivity, faster installation, reduced downtime for repairs. The photographs show neat stacks of rail in a warehouse and clean cross-sections of new and corroded old material. The agency describes the old rail as heavy and stiff, difficult to position, and notes that newer rail is more flexible, easier to handle, and more conductive. It describes the wear mechanism, iron paddles from train cars sliding across the cap to transfer power. It describes the useful life, about 20 years. Read as a maintenance plan, it is reassuring. Read as an obituary for older components, it is a reminder that BART's hazards also age, and that age is not neutral. Age is drift toward corrosion, looseness, resistance, heat, and failure. The 1979 tube fire and the 1992 Oakland derailment appear in documents as separate historical artifacts, one a fire initiated by a short circuit, one a derailment attributed to worn wheel and rail interaction. The Transbay fire included a fatality and 40 injuries, and it shut down tube passenger service until April 5, 1979. The Oakland derailment injured passengers and destroyed third rail coverboard, but did not kill. These distinctions matter legally and operationally. Psychologically, they blur. For writers who know the history, the tube is not merely a link underwater, it is a place where evacuation is possible but difficult, where smoke behaves differently, and where the system once proved that one loose metal cover could take the region's central connection offline for months. There is a form of institutional silence that follows these events. It is not a conspiracy silence, it is the institutional normalization. BART runs again. New employees are trained under updated rules. New hardware is installed. The workforce learns to speak about hazards in shorthand because to speak about them at full length would make the work impossible. Writers return to treating tunnels as scenery and not as environments with failure modes. The city continues, and the tube becomes a blank segment in the mind. But the records do not disappear. They remain accessible, and when read together, they create a sustained image of what a rail system is when it is stripped of marketing and habit. It is a machine that depends on tolerances and on the assumption that hazards remain separated from people by design. The most disturbing moments occur when separation becomes conditional. Conditional on wear standards that are later revised, conditional on communications that fail under stress, conditional on a work practice that assumes a watchman can always produce warning with enough time. Even the onboard recorder footage from Walnut Creek, summarized in the NTSB brief, carries a kind of enduring weight. The operator trainee's repeated pressing of the emergency stop button and the shouted warnings are not only an expression of panic, they are evidence of how the system compresses human agency into a few seconds and a single interface, one red button that cannot overcome physics quickly enough at speed. The system moved correctly according to its control logic. The people on the track did not have a protected space. The result was fatal. The afterword was reform. This sequence is not unique to BART. It is characteristic of complex transportation systems. That is precisely why it is difficult to sit with. In a city like San Francisco, where the ground itself can be unstable, BART is often imagined as stability, a dependable route under streets and water. The darker truth is that stability is manufactured continuously by inspection, replacement, procedure, and the willingness to stop service when risk exceeds what can be tolerated. When a shutdown happens, when the tube is closed for months, when service is disrupted because the environment cannot be made safe, it is not merely an inconvenience. It is a rare moment when the public is forced to acknowledge the system's real condition, not a line on a map, but a set of engineered compromises under stress. The lasting psychological presence of these events is subtle. It is the sensation felt by some riders when a train slows unexpectedly in a tunnel, that the air has weight. It is the brief attention to the coverboard beside the track when the platform is crowded and someone stands too close to the edge. It is the knowledge that somewhere in the system's archive, a fatality is attached to a date and a location and an initiating defect small enough to fit in one hand. BART continues because it must. It continues through replacement cycles and new standards and updated training. It continues through the tube, where the water above is silent and indifferent. The trains still enter that long underwater confinement and emerge, and most riders do not think why that is possible. The documentary record suggests a colder way to understand it. The system runs not because it is inherently safe, but because safety is repeatedly rebuilt, sometimes proactively, often reactively, against a backdrop of forces that do not negotiate. Electricity does not negotiate. Smoke does not negotiate. A train's stopping distance does not negotiate. The only negotiable element is human procedure, and procedure, as BART's history makes clear, is sometimes corrected only after it fails at the cost of a life. And when you return to the images, the tube entrance in flat industrial light, the train crossing in Contra Costa, the warehouse stacks of third rail waiting to replace what has aged out, you can see how a system holds its own darkness without advertising it. The darkness is not supernatural, it is engineered. The darkness of tunnels, the darkness under the bay, the darkness inside institutional memory, where a shutdown is recorded as a reopening date and a probable cause, and where the rest of the story is left for the next failure to reveal.